This is the Capitol Rundown.
Are we going to be united? We're losing our unitedness of the states, and that scares me to death.
There are already on both sides banks of lawyers ready to go into court.
My fear is that if Democrats lose the state house, the Matt Hall version is to grind everything to a halt, and we could see a government shutdown.
It's all straight ahead. The Capitol Rundown starts now.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Siobhan Klepfer. Election Day is almost here, which means from Lansing to Capitol Hill, there is a lot of news to talk about. Michigan is almost sure to play a decisive role in a presidential election for the third consecutive time.
Voters in our battleground state, along with those in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, narrowly elected Republican Donald Trump in 2016 after almost 30 years of supporting Democrats for president. 4 years later, Democrat Joe Biden won back all three states for Democrats with a margin in Michigan of about 154,000 votes out of more than 5.5 million votes cast. Jenna Bednar is a political science professor at the University of Michigan.
Michigan is one of the most interesting states politically. So we have 15 electoral votes. We are truly a 50-50 state. And it's 50-50 in terms of Democrats and Republicans, but then even within those two parties, they're totally fragmented.
Since becoming their party's nominees, former President Trump and Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris have campaigned heavily in the Great Lakes state, hoping to win Michigan's 15 electoral votes. Our state is also among a handful of swing states expected to determine who wins control of the U.S. Senate. Democratic U.S. Representative Elissa Slotkin and former Congressman Republican Mike Rogers are facing off to replace Democratic incumbent Senator Debbie Stabenow.
This is Elissa Slotkin. She currently is in her third term in Congress, and the other is Mike Rogers, who was a member of Congress from the same seat that Elissa Slotkin now is in.
Democratic U.S. Representative Elissa Slotkin and former Congressman Republican Mike Rogers are facing off to replace Democratic incumbent Senator Debbie Stabenow, whose decision to retire has turned what once was a safe seat for Democrats into a pickup opportunity for Republicans. Rogers is the former House Intelligence Committee chairman. He was recruited out of retirement to enter the race, giving Michigan Republicans a chance to end their two-decade drought in races for the U.S. Senate. Bednar says Michigan's voters are similar to those in other battleground states.
Who, though, fail to appeal to the kind of voters that are in Michigan and still win the rest of the country? I don't know, right? Because if you fail to appeal to some of the things that Michigan cares a lot about, then that means for sure you're failing to appeal to Wisconsin, and you're failing to appeal to Pennsylvania, and you may be failing to appeal to North Carolina, and that's a bad record. You've lost them.
So how is voting in Michigan going so far? The Michigan Secretary of State provides an online dashboard for the public to check on ballots sent and ballots turned in. According to the dashboard, as of Friday afternoon, there were 7.3 million active registered voters in the state. Of those, 36% have already either voted by absentee ballot or voted early in person. Voters so far returned 1.8 million absentee ballots. The county with the highest absentee ballot return rate so far is Ingham with 88%. Gogebic County has returned 56% of its ballots, the least in the state. Coming up, we'll take a look at who is in Michigan to campaign on behalf of Elissa Slotkin and Mike Rogers. And up next, control of the State House hangs in the balance, and so do hopes for bipartisan agreement. The Capitol Rundown will be right back. Welcome back. The Michigan House of Representatives is controlled by Democrats, but only just. The balance right now is 56-54, and that could change after Tuesday. Republican State Representative Matt Hall hopes to take the Speaker's chair if that happens. Former Republican Governor Rick Snyder says he's been having conversations with the representative in preparation for that, and he's pushing bipartisanship and compromise.
He's becoming more positive every day that I've interacted with him. I think he would say he's got a positive agenda now.
But Democrats are doubtful, given Representative Hall's alleged unwillingness to work with their party.
My fear is that if Democrats lose the state house, the Matt Hall version is to grind everything to a halt, and we could see a government shutdown.
State Senator Mallory McMurrow spoke with the Rundown about the U.S. Senate race. The Democrat says Michigan should not always be thought of as a blue powerhouse, and polls being tight here prove it.
People need to remember, in the state legislature where I serve, we only have a 2-seat majority in both chambers, which is now reflective of the electorate thanks to our independent map. So Michigan is a battleground state. It's a swing state. There are a lot of people who are really dug in on either side. And those kind of persuadable middle independent voters, both nationally and in Michigan, is a smaller and smaller group of people.
The senator says she's hearing from voters that they're tired of political chaos and want to return to what they say is normalcy.
I remember when Mike Rogers got into the race, I think a lot of us thought, oh my goodness, if there's a candidate who can take on Alyssa, it's Mike Rogers, because of his history in the state, the level of respect that a lot of people have for him. And I think it was a surprise for me and a lot of others to see him flank so far to the right under Donald Trump. He really seems to be kind of in lockstep with Trumpism and the new kind of Trump takeover of the GOP, which is not where most people who are kind of in that independent middle space are these days.
Well, that race between Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin and former Congressman Mike Rogers for our state's open Senate seat is one of the most watched in the country. The campaigns for both candidates are hoping some big names from the political world will help push them to victory. For the Republicans, Senator and Trump loyalist Lindsey Graham of South Carolina was in Oakland County with Mr. Rogers on Monday. They appeared at an event held by the Republican Jewish Coalition. Posting on social media, Senator Graham said the Michigan Jewish community is fired up for Mr. Rogers and Donald Trump. He said they'll be a, quote, strong voice for Israel in our nation's capital. Meanwhile, Mr. Rogers recently sat down with reporters to talk about the race and continued to hit Democrats on the economy and the southern border crisis.
It's a lot of money that we're wasting. Families here are hurting. People can't get their paycheck to go to the end of the month to afford groceries. We meet family after family that has to use the food pantry the last 2 or 3 days to make their budget work because grocery prices have gone up so much.
Well, coming up, we'll have new poll numbers to share on that race and other topics facing Michigan voters. But first, we'll talk to a legal expert about how courts have influenced this election and what we can expect after Election Day. That and much more is coming up. The laws surrounding voting here in Michigan are different than they were 4 years ago. Absentee voting, initially driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, continues to be a huge factor in elections.
Michigan has more open mail-in and early voting because of the proposition that was passed in 2022. So the idea of people voting by mail-in and or early voting has become incredibly popular. And I think we're going to see probably 75 million people voting either mail-in by Election Day or having voted early.
Over the last year, both the Republican National Committee and the state GOP have taken Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to court over changes in election procedures. In March, the RNC argued in court there were more registered voters in Michigan than eligible citizens. The judge said the Republicans' claim was not plausible and did not demonstrate any specific case of an ineligible voter on the state's active voter list. Another lawsuit by Republicans sought to disqualify certain overseas and military members from voting, which a state court rejected. Secretary Benson talked about the efforts to muddy the legal waters around voting when she announced the Michigan Voter Dashboard.
And we've all seen the ways that data taken out of context can be used to distort the truth. That will escalate in the weeks ahead. And we know that as it does, voters will become more and more frustrated as election misinformation becomes increasingly noisier. We also know that official sources of information are more important than ever to help center our conversation on facts and the rule of law, on the truth and the security of our elections.
And while it may seem like Election Day will bring an end to situations like this, Professor Schwartz says that's not likely.
And they'll become, I believe, more prolific at the time after the election. There are already on both sides banks of lawyers ready to go into court, whether to file it for injunctions or to object to things that are occurring. I would venture a guess that they will be overwhelmingly from the Republican Party, unless Donald Trump thinks he's won the election, at which point he has no reason to complain. But at this point, I really don't think it's going to end. We won't really have a firm result in Pennsylvania for a couple of days. We won't have a firm result in Georgia for a couple of days. This is because they can't start counting the early ballots that come in, the mail-in ballots, till after, like Michigan used to be, till after the polls have been closed. And they have to go through a canvassing process before they can count those votes. So I don't think, unless there is an overwhelming victor, I don't think we're going to have a result in probably until Thursday.
Coming up next on The Rundown, our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic will be here to talk about the latest in Michigan politics. But first, we have some new poll results to share about what Michiganders care about when it comes to picking a president. The Capitol Rundown will be right back. Welcome back. A new poll released on Friday shows while some candidates in Michigan seem to be pulling ahead, it's still a very tight race for them. In the poll, 600 Michiganders were asked if the election were held on that day, who would they vote for? 48% said they would vote for Vice President Harris. Donald Trump got 45%. The Democratic candidate's lead, however, falls within the margin of error. Green Party candidate Jill Stein got 3%, and RFK Jr., who is not actually running despite being on the ballot, also got 3%. When that same question was asked about the U.S. Senate race, the Democratic lead was a little wider, with Elissa Slotkin getting 47% versus Mike Rogers at 42%. 6% of respondents say they will vote for a third-party candidate. When asked what the single issue that most affects their vote for president is, the top 4 answers were inflation, abortion rights, immigration, and mental and physical fitness for the office. But what do those or any poll numbers mean this close to Election Day? Our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic spoke to The Rundown's Megan Vaselli about that and more.
It's time to get updated politically, and who better to fill us in than Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic. Tim, it seems like the Michigan U.S. Senate race keeps making headlines, but our 7th congressional district race also is a big one.
These are two competitive races, as we say in the biz, Megan, meaning that they're very close. In fact, in most cases, they're TC, too close to call. The U.S. Senate race, let's take that first. Ms. Slotkin, the Democrat, Mr. Rogers, the Republican. One poll out this week had him ahead by 2 points. Other polls have her ahead by 3 or 4. Those are all, repeat, all within the margin of error, which means regardless of what the headlines say that one or the other has a lead, nobody really has the lead. It's a dead heat. It's a jump ball. It's a flip of the coin. Use whatever metaphor you want to describe. And the voters ultimately will decide this thing on Tuesday. And we'll have a U.S. Senator replacing Debbie Stabenow, who is retiring at the end of her term. It's been a very competitive race, a very expensive race. You know, when these races are part of the equation of control of the U.S. Senate, where 1 or 2 seats either way can determine which party is going to be in control, they gain a lot of attention, both with money and voter attention. So the Slotkin-Rogers race is coming down to the wire. Now, the same thing with the Hertel and the Tom Barrett race here locally. And a couple of interesting polling numbers that came out this past week from Emerson College. Basically, 90% of the people knew who Tom Barrett was. Remember, he ran in this district before. He lost to Slotkin. But 27% don't know who Curtis Hertel is. And he's been around for a long time, so he's got a name ID situation. But this race, also tied and very close, will probably come down to the turnout at MSU, as it did 2 years ago. And Tom Barrett recalls vividly what happened. He went to bed on election night thinking he had won the 7th congressional district, and he woke up and found out that he lost as the MSU vote came in enough numbers to turn the election around. The Barrett people have been trying to inoculate him from the same thing happening again. The Hertel people have their collective fingers crossed that MSU will ride in on its green and white horse and carry him to victory. And once again, we won't know until Tuesday as to who's going to Congress and who's staying back home to either fly his helicopter or cut the grass. It's one or the other.
Well, coming up, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden held an event for the last time during their stay in D.C., the annual White House Halloween party. But first, we'll take you to Holland on Halloween, where people were asked what scares them about Tuesday. The Capitol Rundown. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The election is just 2 days away, and for some people that's causing some anxiety. So on Halloween, we asked, what's so scary about Tuesday? During a haunted house event at the Felt Estate in Holland, Michiganders dressed up on Thursday for tricks and treats and to talk about Election Day fears.
I think my biggest fear of this election is going forward, are we going to be united? We're losing our unitedness of the states, and that scares me to death. And I don't care what side you're on, but we all need to come together. And no matter who wins, let's come together. That's my fear. That's a big fear.
The scariest thing would be maybe if not enough people turn out to vote. You know, everyone's vote is important, whether who you're voting for, you know. So just showing up to the election, you know, and getting your voice out there is like a big step in itself.
Well, the fact that Trump could be elected and just everything that he stands for is like what's scary to me.
Harris winning, to be honest, it's just a lot of unknowns, kind of scary.
Wednesday night was a spooky one at the White House as the President and First Lady held their last Halloween party there. President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, dressed in a panda bear costume, hosted students, children of service members, and neighborhood families at the White House for trick-or-treating on Halloween Eve. With the theme Hallow Read at the White House, the first couple handed out candy and books to trick-or-treaters. The violin section of the military band provided the scary music. The Bidens say the event is something they've looked forward to every year. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching the Capitol Rundown. We will see you all again right here next week.